All right, so in this video of our studio assembly series, I want to talk to you about power in the studio. So I was an electrician here in Canada for many years. We're actually going to look at the Canadian Electrical Code. It's all to do with like law, because what's happened is house fires have happened, people have died, and that's why they have code rules for safety. So when we are building a home studio, most people always want to get into the equipment right away, like your speakers, MIDI, keyboard, audio interface, all that kind of stuff. But I want to talk to you about power first, okay? So in recent years, I picked up a power conditioner. It just kind of protects your equipment in case of any lightning strikes and stuff like that. So this thing gets power, we turn it on, then we plug in, let's say, our computer, speakers, everything is just off of here, so it's kind of safer. Now, this thing is really just an expensive, glorified power bar. So for example, if you look down here, this is just a power bar. So, you know, just like I shared in the previous video where I set up these on the side of my desk where I can turn off and on my speakers, right? Just from a power bar. This is really, really awesome for workflow. This thing right here is just a power bar, essentially. It's just a little bit more expensive. Do you need one? No. Just kind of nice in the studio, makes it look a little bit more professional, and you can just kind of plug all your stuff in and get things really organized. But I first want to start off this video about power in the home studio, right? So if you've never seen a plug before or how a plug works, I'll break that down for you just really simply. So you can see this is a 15 amp breaker. You actually don't get 15 amps out of a breaker. These are what's called 80% rated, meaning that you only get 80% of the breaker. And what happens is when the wire gets too hot, it will trip, okay? My disclaimer, don't listen to anything I'm doing. My highest recommendation is to reach out to a local inspector. You just call them, say, hey, I'm doing whatever, and they are there to answer your questions, okay? All right, so let's first talk about a plug. Okay, so if you've never seen a plug before, this is how it works in North America. So we have a hot and a neutral, which is our white. So our hot is gold, all right? And as you can see, it has a little tab here which joins the top and the bottom, but you can actually break that tab if you want two different circuits, or if you want one to be switched. Sometimes you see like a lamp is switched on the top and then one is constant power. That is how you do that. You just break that tab, okay? So this is our hot. Here is our neutral. These are our silver. And then we have our bond. This is a bond. It's not a ground. There's only one ground in a home, and then everything else is bonded, okay? So that's called a bond. Now in the back here, so how we actually connect our wires onto this plug is the best way is to hook, okay? So we create a little hook with our wire. This is copper if you've never seen it before. And this is a 14 gauge wire. And so we just put this on here, just like this. So it's a little hard to do it well on the camera. So we hook it on like that, okay? And then when we tighten it, the screw is going to tighten our hook, making a very tight connection, okay? Now, you might see how the back here has a bunch of these push-ins. So you can actually push your wire in, but do not do that. It's a very bad installation. Yes, it's approved, but in terms of maintenance and workflow, being an electrician for many, many years, do not use these back tabs, okay? You want to create your hooks, and then you just put it on clockwise so that when it tightens, then you're good to go, okay? So that's a breakdown of a plug. So this is a 15 amp plug, which goes on, let's say, a 15 amp breaker. This here you can see has a T. This is a 20 amp plug. And sometimes if you're building a new studio, sometimes it's nice to have a 20 amp plug, but you will need number 12 wire, okay? And so when we're talking about wire, we're talking about amperage, because when we look in the code book, which we'll look in a second, when it's about the wires, it's always about protecting the wire. Because what happens, so when you ask for too much power from a wire, it gets really hot. It'll actually start glowing to the point of causing a house fire. So that is where, when it comes to our electrical system, there's essentially three components. There is the device that you're using, you know, you're going to plug it in. There's the actual wire. Is the wire able to handle the amperage? Okay. And then we have protection. So this is a circuit breaker. There are different forms of protection, like a fuse. But how this works is, let's say it's on, and then there's too much amperage on this wire. This wire will start heating up, and then here it will trip. Again, just because it has 15 on it doesn't mean that you get 15 amps out of it. They're 80% rated, which means that you only get 12 amps out of your circuit. So what does that mean? Well, let's say one speaker is an amp. So let's say you have two speakers, so that's 2 amps. Then you have a computer. Let's say the computer is 1 amp. So now you're up to 3 amps. Everything is spliced together from box to box, so it's all on one circuit, okay? So again, if you're gonna be building a home studio from scratch, I would definitely look into running a 20 amp plug, which means you're gonna need 12 gauge wire, and then you would be able to have a 20 amp breaker. But again, 20 amps times 0.8, which is 80%, so you only get 16 amps. It doesn't mean that you're gonna get better quality power, it just means that you have more amperage to work with before a breaker will trip, okay? Because typically in a home studio, like or a home bedroom studio, we only have one circuit. So you just gotta be thinking about how much we're loading on our circuit. Okay, so here is the electrical code book, but I just want to share with you that, when I went to school, a lot of highlighting, right? So what I'm sharing with you in this video may not be relevant, especially if you are in America. But anyway, so how this code book works is it's essentially telling you what you are and are not allowed to do. So anyways, what I want to share with you here, because I was telling you that a 14 gauge wire, so this white wire, we have a hot, we have a neutral, and we have a bond. This is what we call a 14-2. We do not count the bond wire as a conductor. So this is called like our sheathing. Then we have our conductor, and the black is the insulation. Same with the white is the insulation. And then we have our conductors, our copper and copper, okay? So again, this is a 14-2. This is the white wire. Same thing with the yellow wire. So this is called a 12-2 because it's 12 gauge wire. Okay, so it can take more amps. And it's the same thing. So it's a 12-2 because we have a black, a white, and then a bond. Okay, so looking at this white wire, we see that it's 14 gauge copper. Okay, it's 2 conductors. So this is your typical home wire. So it's called Romex or NMD is what the code book calls it, NMD, okay? All right, so what I wanna say is a 14 gauge wire, I just showed that was 14 gauge. Here in the table, you can see we go to 14, and this is for copper. Okay, it's important because some homes are wired in aluminum, so the rules are a little bit different for aluminum in terms of ampacity, so how many amps the wire can hold. Because again, I told you, a lot of people, when it comes to electricity and stuff, they always talk about watts. And that is important to know with the watts, which I'll explain in just a moment, but the code book is all about amps when you're protecting the wire. So what I want to tell you is there's a rule in the code book that says you're only allowed to use a 14 for the 15 amps for general purpose stuff. So for example, your plugs, your switches in your home. But for certain situations like motors or for heating loads, such as like baseboard heaters, this is where we can actually use a number 14 wire for higher amperage. But for general purpose stuff, a 14 gauge wire, okay, so a 14 gauge wire has to go on a 15 amp breaker for general purpose stuff like plugs and switches in the home. Again, I'm telling you that when it comes to your home studio, if you're gonna be building it from scratch, definitely look into a 20 amp plug, which means you need 12-2. But for most of you in your bedroom studios, you are going to have your plug just like this, so not with the T. So the T is 20 amp, okay? And again, we look right here. So it says 20 amps, and then this one here is 15 amps and 125 volts, okay? So you might hear people say 110 volts or 120 volts. So the utility company who provides you your power at a bare minimum has to give you at least 110 volts, because what happens with voltage is if you get not enough voltage, let's say you get like only 90 volts, your equipment will start actually bogging down. It'll start going whoom, whoom, okay? It needs to get a decent amount of voltage for it to run as designed, because when we're talking about computers and electronics and all that stuff, everything has been designed around within that 110 volts to that 125 volt area. So if you put too much voltage to something, like let's say light bulbs, they'll actually get really, really bright, but then they burn out quicker, okay? And you can always plug things into your wall to see what voltage you're getting. All right, so there's 2 triangles that you wanna know. So one is called Ohm's law, and again, this is just really, really basic stuff. We have voltage, we have current, which is I, could just be A, and then we have R for our resistance. Volts, amps, and then this is resistance. And then this one right here, this is going to be our power triangle. So we have P, and then you have V, and then you have I. What are these triangles? What does this mean? Well, it's just a math equation. So if you are wanting to find wattage, okay, so this is power, so this is actually watts, this is volts, and this is amperage. So let's just do a quick little calculation just for you to see, because it's actually really easy once you understand the basics. So let's just say we have 120 volts, okay, and watch, I put the line here, and we're just going to follow this. So if we have these two, for example, then we're going to find R. Okay, so 120 volts, let's say we have 10 amps, and then what is this right here? Well, it's going to be 12 ohms. Okay, makes sense? So all you have to do is just follow this triangle for your calculations, and that's how you find that out. Now let's say we want to find wattage, okay? So we already have voltage, we already have amperage. So again, I'm just going to draw a new triangle here, but I don't have to do the actual triangle, I'll just draw the T. And so let's go voltage, so 120 volts. Let's go 10 amps. So what is our wattage, right? So 120 times 10, so that's 1200 watts. And for making beats, this is probably pretty much all you really need, give or take. Now let's just say maybe you have one microphone that you plug into like a nice preamp or something. So let's just say preamp. Now this is not your audio interface. I'm talking about like a separate single channel preamp like I shared with you before that you're gonna plug in a microphone. Let's just say that's like 100 watts. Okay, again, I'm just throwing random numbers out there. You're gonna have to look at your product. You know, I might have a camera, right? I have lights. The thing that's nice is now LEDs. So LED bulbs are much less wattage. So back in the day, a 60 watt bulb was actually 60 watts, but an LED nowadays is like what, 13 watts. Now, when you are plugging into the wall, it is probably nice to get some type of power bar because they do offer a form of protection. Sometimes they have like their own little circuit breaker in there, which is nice. They also sometimes have protection for, you know, against lightning strikes, all that kind of stuff. And sometimes they even have like some filtering. One thing just to keep in mind when it comes to electricity as well as music production, really anything when it comes to sine waves, there's a lot of kind of, you know, stuff that people will kind of say that makes, oh, it's going to make your sound way better or way cleaner. Now, sometimes you might run into like ground loop issues where like there's buzzing and all that kind of stuff. I'm not going to go into that in this video, but when it comes to home studio, you can look into like a pure sine wave generator. They're a little expensive, but if you're wanting a really clean power to your studio, that is something you can look into. You can also look into a UPS. If your power goes out, it's called an uninterrupted power supply. And sometimes those UPSs have a pure sine generator in there. So you can get all in one, but you know, sometimes it maybe has a fan, so maybe it could be a little bit loud. So these are all things you have to think about, okay? All right, so I hope you found that helpful. Probably a little bit too involved for the general home studio, you know, producer, because again, like I'm saying, you're just going to plug in your power just into a plug. But like I said, you probably do want to have some type of power bar that gives you some protection, as well as it just gives you more things to plug in. But again, the more things you're plugging in, for example, like a printer, you have your computer screens. I don't have a speaker there, but it would be a speaker, right? Different lights. Again, these are LED bulbs now, so it's not as much wattage. The biggest thing I just really wanted to get across though in this video is you want to be thinking about how are you going to power your stuff? You know, how are you going to run your cables? And that's where this power conditioner, again, this is just no different than a glorified power bar. Okay, it's just a little bit nicer. It goes into a rack unit and all the wires are kind of hidden in the back. But it's just, you just want to think about, you know, for example, from plugging in from here, I have to go all the way around, right, to plug into my computer. And most computers and speakers, they don't have very long power cables. They might be like, you know, 6 feet, but this is probably like a 15-foot run to plug in. So you just want to think about, you know, how am I plugging my devices in from my power source, because this comes from the wall. So I plug it into the wall. Now this thing is only 15 amp rated. And I think you are able to get this in the 20 amp version. This also comes in like a voltage regulator, because like I said, when it comes to like 110 volts, 120 volts, a regulator will keep your voltage at a more steady rate. When we plug this in, you know, what are we powering in our studio? I have one for like my monitors. This is something actually I didn't share with the monitors, which is what I wanted to share with you. This is just a little power bar on the desk. So you plug it in, and then we have 2 switches in the top here, and then has plugs on the side. I'm just using this for my monitors because otherwise what I would have had to have done is plug each monitor into here. And this is actually bad practice. So when it comes to plugging in power bars and all that kind of stuff, you never want to have a power bar and then you plug another power bar into here. So now you have more plugins and then more. That is against code and it's like a fire hazard. But again, don't listen to anything I'm doing in these videos. But what I'm essentially doing is this is like a power bar and I'm plugging a power bar into here just so I can have like a switch. And I know that I'm not using much power, okay? So it's not like I am at a risk of fire. But one thing to say is the longer your cable run, you lose voltage a little bit. Now, you don't lose tons of voltage, but you might lose a couple volts, especially if you're plugging into here, which has, like if we look at the cable, so the cable right there is kind of coiled up, so it's a little long. And then don't forget, that comes from the panel. So wherever your panel is, that whole wire run has to go to this plug. Then it plugs from here, 15 feet of wire, again, into here. And then if I'm plugging into here, another 15 feet into there, and then from there, another 15 feet. So you can see that the wire starts adding up, which means you're going to get voltage drop. And all of these things are things you have to think about for electrical safety. So at the end of the day, if you want something really simple, you just want one power bar, you plug your stuff in, you're good to go. That is it for the home studio power overview. If you have any questions, just leave comments below. And if you guys want to learn to make professional beats with FL Studio, you guys can visit me over at itsgratuitous.com. There's over 34 FL Studio courses, teach you tons of stuff about beat making, playing piano as a producer. And as we go throughout this series, I'm just going to break down different parts of the studio. One other thing I forgot to mention in this video is just you have to think about, all your connections. So not just power, okay? You also want to be thinking about, HDMI or DisplayPort, because like I said, a lot of these computers these days, sometimes they only have like one HDMI port and then they'll have like a DisplayPort, right? And DVI is kind of going away. So again, these are all things that you have to think about. Do your cables reach your computer? For example, if I'm going to be plugging in my speakers, ideally you want to have the same length of cable, for your audio cables, because there could be a delay there. Like now again, that's like super, super extreme, because if you have like a 10-foot cable and a 6-foot cable, everything's going to be good to go. Like you're not going to notice it. But again, if you're talking really, really technical stuff, if you want like a really professional studio, these are the things you want to think about, Like, so for example, if you're going to buy speaker cables and let's say your audio interface is right here, you're going to think to yourself, oh, well, I only need like a 5-foot cable, so I'm going to save money and I'm going to buy a 5-foot cable. But then over there, I need like let's say a 12-foot cable or a 15-foot cable. In my opinion, I would say just buy 2 15-foot cables, because that way, if you ever move, you can do whatever you want, and the cables are going to be the same length to each speaker. And then once you're up and running and rolling, you're good to go. And then if you ever want to kind of like add or remove things, it's just a matter of like, let's say like this monitor I didn't like, I could easily switch the monitor because, that's how easy it's going to be. But it's just focusing on what do you need as a producer to flow. And that's probably the hardest thing as a producer, is to learn what do you actually need for you to get your fast workflow. So once I get all this stuff cleaned up, everything will look much cleaner, especially when the MIDI keyboard's there. Again, just visit me over at itsgratuitous.com. I have a dedicated platform there, tons of courses. Just send me an email if you have questions at hi@itsgratuitous.com. If you're wanting to learn FL Studio, check out the 3 exclusive videos I have for you. You can get them by going to itsgratuitous.com/FL Studio. I hope to see you inside.